an historic bullish setup for silver. Hi everyone and welcome to Ainsley Insights, brought to you by Ainsley Bullion, Ainsley Crypto and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, welcome back Dhruv to talk more silver. We've been talking a lot of this recently, but there's so much happening here that really we do need to keep coming back to it with different people to get different perspectives on it. How are you going today, Dhruv?
Good, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, good. Now, I know you and I can't stop talking about silver. Every time we catch up, we're talking about how we think about it, what's going on. You've spoken recently about a couple of new areas that I'd like to bring into this conversation, and that's specifically starting around what China's doing. And there was an interesting point you made around how they were purchasing effectively unrefined silver concentrates directly from miners, and this was really cutting into supply. So can you maybe start us off today just getting into the weeds a little bit around what China's doing?
Yeah, look, China's stockpiling massive amounts of resources across the board, and gold and silver both are included in this. Various reasons. They're probably looking to move away from the US dollar to have, geopolitical sovereignty coming into later this decade, with their pretty clear plans to move into Taiwan. They've seen what's happened with Russia and Ukraine and that side of the world, and I think they've learned a few lessons there. So one aspect of stockpiling gold specifically is probably just moving away from US government debt as their collateral, but they're also stockpiling resources across the board. China's a net importer of food and energy, and that's where their silver stockpiles get quite interesting, because there are a lot of industrial use cases for silver. A big part of that is solar panels. So while they're focusing on, currently their energy is with coal, they're a net importer of coal. But while they're focusing on increasing alternative forms of energy like nuclear, a big part of that is stockpiling silver for solar panels. There is speculation that the silver stockpiling has to do with a monetary aspect as well. So whether there's a BRICS currency coming about that's backed by a basket of commodities is still speculation. But China is stockpiling massive amounts of silver directly from miners, so unrefined, and then refining themselves. This is an impact avoidance strategy. And the point of this is basically to stockpile as much as they need to without affecting the spot price directly. It still affects supply, of course, but it doesn't really show up on the spot price immediately. And that's so that they're able to get their resources in place before the price going up too much. But it creates a very interesting dynamic in terms of the supply situation for silver, where there's already been a shortage of about 1 billion ounces over the last 5 years. So I think that's going to add to that significantly.
And that's very interesting, because when you talk about that, there's always been criticism around China, and in particular around their data, saying they tend to do things in a little bit of a sneaky way when it comes to this. And that this would be a good example of that, where you don't impact the prices because you just buy the silver directly. So you're not really buying it on the market as such, but it is impacting demand. I know we had a comment in one of the other videos talking about silver that was saying, yeah, but you've been going on about this, or not us specifically, but people have been going on about this for a very long time. I've heard about silver shortages for decades now. What's your response to that against this? Is this a little bit different this time, do you think?
No, look, that's awesome to see. I love seeing frustration amongst market participants just as we enter an extremely bullish setup. It's just another bullish indicator to show capitulation amongst people that have been bullish for a long time and are tired of waiting for what would naturally take a few years to play out anyway. And that's just another bullish sign. So, there's the technical setup, which is a cup and handle pattern just on price that's broken above the 50% level off the pattern and is holding there and is continuing up. So that's a technical bullish setup. You combine that with the supply and demand dynamics, where you've got nations stockpiling, a supply shortage. You've got the physical to paper ratios of 1 to 400 roughly for the futures markets. That shows, massive supply shortage as well of the physical product. And then you add sentiment onto that with people getting frustrated. It's just, the icing on the cake in terms of the overall setup. And with the futures markets, I'll mention they're in backwardation at the moment as well. I believe they still are, where there's such a demand for immediate physical settlement that there's a negative carry cost. So the cost of getting silver in the future is cheaper than getting silver today, which means people are happy to pay a premium for physical delivery rather than have somebody else hold it for them, cover all the costs of storage and insurance and everything. Rather than paying them for that, they'd rather pay more and just get it today and have the cost of storage and everything on themselves.
So that backwardation angle that you've talked about before as well, is that the potential setup for a squeeze? Is that how that works?
I'd say so. It basically shows that when there's such a shortage of the physical metal, there's a scramble for it. You'll see a spike in lending rates, and then you see a disconnect between the futures markets and the physical markets. And that's where, because of a scramble for the product, just like any supply-demand dynamic, you'll see a rise in price in that situation. So that's essentially a supply squeeze playing out, in that situation.
You talked about China before, but another interesting player here that you've mentioned recently that I haven't really heard much about is India. And you highlighted that they have recently imported a lot of silver from the UAE, and that this potentially has an impact as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, I've just had a quick look at the numbers. India's imported 2,600 tons of silver from the UAE. Now, that's a significant portion of the global output. So that's just another example of the Asian countries in particular driving this supply shortage, and the backwardation in futures markets, I think, are actually driven by industrial demand from the Eastern nations, more so than anything else.
So that's interesting. So you're effectively saying there that the India story could be more base level production than necessarily hoarding, whereas the Chinese one is probably more about hoarding for potential monetary side of it. Is that how you read it?
I actually think the hoarding for the monetary side of it could be playing into the Indian story as well. Right. There is just speculation as to exactly what it is, what the reason for it is. But my view on that would be that, we see BRICS nations stockpiling essential resources coming into a cyclical point where we would expect globalization to really struggle and geopolitical sovereignty to be the name of the game in terms of moving away from Western influences. So seeing these nations stockpile silver is completely expected. I'd expect this with commodities across the board in general.
And following up on that, you've talked about this quite extensively, this idea of where we are in these particular cycles, that is not unexpected. We've heard this terminology in different ways, whether it was the fourth turning terminology that we've heard mentioned in the past. You've talked about land cycles, socioeconomic cycles. All of them are pointing to us really not, we shouldn't be surprised with the level of upheaval that's happening at the moment. Do you want to maybe just give us the brief overview of your current perspective on what we're seeing across the world, why some of these countries will be, for example, stockpiling silver in this case against that backdrop?
Yeah, from a cyclical fourth turning point of view, essentially the four turnings are 4 20-year phases, makes up 1 80-year cycle. And as we move from one 20-year phase to the other, you see a bit of chaos and essentially a crisis. But as you move from 1 80-year cycle to the next, you see entire systems be torn down in the fourth turning, and then new systems established by the end of the fourth turning to kick off the first turning of the next 80-year cycle. So the last fourth turning ended with World War II. And the first turning, we had the IMF, the World Bank, Bretton Woods, and all these new systems set up, essentially with a gold-backed US dollar. That system's played out. The Bretton Woods ended in 1971. We've had competitive currency devaluation since then, the petrodollar, and now we've essentially got people moving away from the US dollar. We're moving countries setting themselves up for a new system. The thing is, when you're setting yourself up for a new system and you don't know exactly what that system is, you need to go back to basics. You need to go back to resources that are going to be essential to build this new system. You set your building blocks back up again. And as far as a monetary system goes, you look for something that's been part of a monetary system that is over thousands of years, because you're looking at moving from 100-year cycle to the next. So gold and silver are basically God's money. They've been around since the dawn of time, and they've been used as money for thousands of years because of their properties. The 5 main properties of money are in both gold and silver. So these countries stockpiling critical resources are essentially setting themselves up for the turbulent transition from one system to the next. During this time, you're not going to really see nations cooperating like they have been for the first, second, and the third turning. In the fourth turning, nations are going to want to do things their own way to make sure that they're the dominant ones in the next phase. So everyone's competing for supremacy. And as the dust settles, that's when nations will start cooperating, and you'll see globalization start to come in again gradually. But during that time, you're not going to see resources flying across the world or, going by a boat across the world like they used to. And so from a monetary side, yep, gold and silver will have a part to play in this transition and into the new system, as it always has. But you're probably going to see things like tariffs and all these other things that are becoming more common every day increase, not just from the US, but from nations around the world, where trade wars, cold wars, that sort of thing are a part of it as well.
And one final question to wrap this up, something that's been playing in my mind recently. I was having a discussion with a colleague about what a potential scenario would be if we were to move, when I say we, I mean globally, move away a little bit from the US dollar. And part of that discussion was around SDRs, or special drawing rights, that sort of internationally agreed currency basket. Rather than using the US dollar, you're using a mixture of other currencies. And part of my response to that was, I said, I just don't think that's viable, because when you think about anything like that, a basket of currencies, it's effectively still a rules-based system that's set up. And how you've been describing it, this is all of the types of things that come unraveled at the end of this cycle. So it doesn't make sense to me that we're going to get, that might be the outcome that you would describe as that first turning when we move into new rules-based orders. But during this last phase, I think if it's every man for himself, then you would probably be looking more at something like gold and silver as well in that scenario, things that are outside of any system rather than an agreed upon system to be the solution. How do you think about that?
I fully agree. I mean, a basket of currencies is going to require even more cooperation than we have right now. So if we're moving away from human-based systems cooperating with one another, you want something that's decentralized, that's not connected to any particular government, that doesn't really involve a human or a collection of humans at the center of it to be making decisions with other groups of humans. And this is where assets like gold and silver come in, potentially Bitcoin. I mean, it's completely untested. We've got about 15 to 16 years of data in Bitcoin. So it's still highly speculative. But gold and silver have seen so many of these cycles that it's really just business as usual. And like you said, in the first turning of the next cycle, that's going to be really interesting to see what the new systems are and whether there is a basket of currencies, whether it is more a BRICS-dominated world. It's really all yet to be seen, whether there is some sort of one world type of government that comes out. We had the United Nations and all of that sort of come through. So whether there is more cooperation for better or worse, that's not something that we're going to see, I don't think, as we get to the end of this fourth turning. But certainly, in the 2030s, that's basically baked into the cake.
Always thoroughly enjoy these conversations. We just explore such interesting topics, and it always still comes back to these core metals. And really, it's fascinating to me that something that's thousands of years old ends up being the solution to a very modern, what seems like a modern problem, but as you pointed out, is a tale as old as time. So thank you, as always, for your deep dive on that. I appreciate it always, Dhruv. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Chris. Good to chat to you.
Good to chat to you. Thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll chat again soon.